Thank you, Father Lawrence, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us again for this third talk, and a particular welcome to anyone who is joining us in this series for the first time. One of the lovely things I'm discovering about a series like this is the way it becomes a collaborative effort. I've proposed to explore a theme that matters to me and which speaks, I hope, to some of the issues that matter for our world. Each week, my own thinking unfolds in ways I don't fully anticipate. And then in sharing that with you, I receive responses which raise questions, invite clarification, and the making of further connections. So as Father Lawrence said, I want to begin tonight by recapping where we are and engaging with some of those responses. Last week, in our exploration of the shape of Christian virtue, I found myself talking about the virtue of necessity. I'd been struck by the insistence in the first letter of Peter, as well as in the writing of theologians such as Simone Weil and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that obedience is a key virtue in holy living. In fact, Weil claims it is the supreme virtue. I think one dimension of this emphasis on obedience is relatively uncontroversial. The idea that we should be obedient to God, or that our lives should flow out of deep listening and responsiveness to the Word, to the Spirit of God, is familiar territory for all Christians and for contemplatives. I've often quoted Father Lawrence saying, obedience is not doing what you're told, but becoming the word you hear. This obedience, this virtue of obedience, reflects the necessity in Christian life for deepening self-dispossession. In terms of our concern for the shape of Christian virtue, I drew out the extent to which this radical obedience or deep listening for God is the ground of true goodness. Both Weil and Bonhoeffer insist that we do not do good by acting in accord with our idea of the good, or by working towards what we think is a desirable outcome. We do good only to the extent that we respond faithfully to the will of God. And I quoted Weil, who said, "We should not take one step, even in the direction of what we think is good, beyond that to which we are irresistibly impelled by God." And this applies to action, word, and thought. Now, last week, we acknowledged that what it looks like to practice this obedience and how we discern the will of God isn't always obvious. But the exhortation to obedience itself in this context is, I think, relatively uncontroversial. A second dimension of the call to obedience as intrinsic to holy living is, however, much more difficult. In the first letter of Peter, readers are urged to obey not only God, but the givenness of the life in which they find themselves. Or perhaps it's better to say they are to obey God in and through the lives they are now living. This includes undergoing without complaint the suffering that befalls them and accepting the givenness of human structures and institutions over them. The text notoriously speaks of slaves obeying their masters, even if they treat them harshly, and wives their husbands. And the profoundly counterintuitive claim seems to be that accepting the givenness of the lives we're in is, at least in the first instance, an access to participating in God's goodness and of enabling God's will to be done on earth. And it's in response to this aspect of the exhortation to obedience that several of you, or many of you, have raised important and searching questions. These questions can be divided, I think, into two main subsets. The first invites clarification of the distinction between obedience as coercion versus obedience as acceptance or free consent. In the talk last week, I suggested that one way to explore the moral significance of practicing obedience to the givenness of our lives is by bringing to mind aspects of our own lives that we find hard or troubling, that we wish were otherwise. Maybe it's a painful family dynamic or entanglement in an unjust system. Maybe some other kind of suffering or difficulty, an illness or some other kind of constraint. My experience is that if we want some aspect of our life or of ourselves to be transformed, it doesn't work to begin by resisting it, fighting it. Somehow, I have to begin by accepting that it is as it is. I have to draw it close, as it were, to relinquish my resistance. It seems to be a spiritual law that if I can't be with how things are, if I am unwilling to undergo the suffering of what's unreconciled, then I'm actually refusing or negating the possibility of its transformation. What we resist persists, as the saying goes. And here we might think of the transformative dynamic of the Buddhist practice of Tonglen, breathing in suffering and breathing out peace and love. Jesus spoke of turning the other cheek. Well, in response to this, someone wrote the following: I still have considerable disquiet around the word obedience, especially when paired with situations where people are being oppressed. I guess it depends on what is meant by the word obedience. I find that I breathe more easily if I use the word acceptance. I think that when we find ourselves individually and perhaps collectively in dark spots and difficult situations, if we can bring ourselves to genuine acceptance of the isness of the situation, then we stay open. And if we are lucky, through that openness enters grace. Well, this beautifully expresses the nature of the obedience I think is at issue here. Obedience as radical and intentional acceptance of the given while remaining open to the presence of God, open to the possibility of transformation and the call to transformative action. It's to be distinguished from obedience as mere coercion by or resignation to circumstances which are assumed to be fixed or closed to possibility. But this raises the question, since the word obedience is so susceptible of misunderstanding in this context, why not just speak of acceptance? Well, I think very often we can. But my sense is that there's something about the notion of obedience that may remain important despite our discomfort with it. To my ear, at least, what obedience evokes is the experience of constraint we consent to undergo in the process of this work of acceptance, this letting go of resistance. It names the sense in which it's painful, a kind of narrow gate. I would not choose for things to be as they are, and yet I must begin at least by freely embracing them. It is not my will, yet I must at some level let it be my will. The mystery is that it is possible to turn circumstances that are objectively coercive or overpowering into occasions for radical acceptance, if we can undergo them in a certain spirit. And this creates space for possibility, for reconciliation and peace. This is the obedience Jesus practiced when he set his face to Jerusalem and when he yielded himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. In Luke's Gospel, he speaks of his moving towards death in these terms: I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under, or how straitened I am until it is completed. The paradox of this kind of obedience is that by freely consenting to be subject to what befalls, noting that this free consent may be costly and hard won, what is created is a new kind of freedom. As I said before, we go through the narrow gate in such a way as to create space for grace, for God to act. And this, I think, is what Rowan Williams means when he speaks of Jesus' obedience to suffering and death as active and transfiguring acceptance of the world's limit. Well, the second subset of responses to last week's talk raised concerns about the relationship between obedience and mere compliance. In the circumstances of our lives, what stops our radical acceptance of or obedience to the given from being culpable acquiescence to injustice, or a refusal of the risk of action and protest, mere quietism? And what's key here, I think, is that though in the first instance we're seeking not to resist what is, we're always listening for God in and through what is. Last week I quoted words of Martin Luther King, who spoke of loving the segregationist and honouring their reality while remaining faithful to the call to enable the full humanity of all. For myself, I've been exploring what it might look like to stop inwardly resisting those in Australia who are intractably opposed to serious action on climate change and who seem to me criminally self-interested and irresponsible. Could I actually bring myself to genuine acceptance of the isness of the situation and of these people while holding it all open to grace? It seems to me that far from being passive, conscienceless acquiescence, this seeking to be wholly with what is, while being open to God, is, like meditation, a form of pure action. It does not displace our outward action, nor our responsibility for our choices, for what we do next. If anything, it deepens our responsibility because it requires us to attend more deeply to the whole, and so to what true responsiveness to God in and through the situation amounts to. Rather than being driven entirely by my reaction to injustice, it makes it possible for me to be involved at a level beyond my will and preference. And this tends to shift the way action unfolds. It can make visible new and different possibilities for action, and it changes the energy from which action arises. I know these are difficult and subtle questions, and we're well aware of the abuses connected with either exhorting others to obedience, whatever their situation, and also the dangers of justifying our own actions with reference to obedience. I was just obeying orders. I was just following the rules. But in the first of our series, I spoke of how Christian virtue is what grows in us as we participate in the vitality of God's own life, as we come to share the mind of Christ. And what I think we begin to see, or I begin to see, is that obedience is the practice preeminently that allows for this flowing through us of God's goodness and grace. And this is because obedience, in the sense of deep listening for God, leads us to be self-dispossessed and radically available. And obedience, in the sense of active acceptance of what is. This is how we consent to undergo the suffering of the world so as to participate in its transformation. It is, if you like, our sharing in the Paschal mystery. The practice of obedience invites us to the inside of our own and the world's pain, rather than trying to fix it from the outside, no matter how well-intentioned our efforts. It's the inner act that joins us beyond self-will with God's continuous action to reconcile and recreate. I'll say that last bit again. Obedience is the inner act that joins us beyond self-will with God's continuous action to reconcile and recreate. At the end of last week, I suggested that this work of obedience is what leads us then to the lived experience of what our tradition calls the theological virtues, the virtues of faith, hope, and love. It's how we start to know what these virtues really mean, because we find them growing in us and shaping all that we are and do. And so in the remainder of this talk, that's the understanding I'd like to explore in a little more depth. So faith, hope, love. In Catholic moral theology, there are quite technical ways of speaking about these three theological virtues. According to tradition, they are distinguished from what are called the cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, self-control, and justice. Because unlike the cardinal virtues, the theological virtues cannot be acquired by human effort. They are infused by divine grace. Their origin, motive, and object is God. And the Catechism teaches that faith is the virtue of believing the truths of divine revelation. Hope is the virtue of trusting to attain life everlasting. And love is the virtue of loving God for God's own sake and loving humanity for the sake of God. Well, I'm aware that I'm not nearly as educated in moral theology as I should be. And while I don't disagree with any of this, I'm not sure this way of talking about the virtues of faith, hope, and love connects very deeply to people in our culture. So what I'd like to do is to say a little about my sense of the lived experience of these graces. I hope that some of this might resonate with your experience, or at least evoke for you reflections on your experience. And so help us together to reflect on how growing in these virtues might matter for our being in the world. So first, faith. Faith concerns our sense of how the world is, the nature of the world we inhabit. Philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch once pointed out that the choices we make, the actions that seem possible or necessary for us, are profoundly shaped by our underlying imaginative sense of the world, the way we see things as a whole. This is often a subtle matter. Our pictures of how things are may not be front of mind for us. We may not be explicitly conscious of them, but they are operative. Albert Einstein made the same kind of point. The most important question you can ever ask, he said, is whether the world is a friendly place. Murdoch recognised that some of our most significant moral differences are not because we make different choices within the same world, but because we see different worlds. Someone who lives in a world coloured by threat and condemnation or scarcity inhabits a different reality, sees different possibilities than one who lives in a world of abundance and welcome. For the first disciples, their experience of Jesus affected their picture of the world at this fundamental level. Jesus had been among them as their teacher and companion. He'd claimed a particular relationship with God as his Abba, Father, and lived a certain kind of life. He'd gone about proclaiming forgiveness, offering mercy and healing, practicing radical hospitality towards the religiously and legally excluded, teaching with unusual authority and freedom. As a consequence, he'd fallen foul of the authorities and been executed. Yet astoundingly, mysteriously, death turned out not to have been the end of him. And when he returned to his disciples crucified, yet somehow alive and still bearing peace, they began to believe that who he was and all he had lived and taught could not be brought to an end. It began to dawn on them that there is a reality that cannot be controlled or cancelled by the violence of the world, and that this reality is God, and God is inexhaustibly for us. It's in this context, I think, that we can hear the astonishing words of St. Paul. If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not withhold his own Son, but gave him up for all of us, will he not with him also give us everything else? And he goes on, for I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. You can hear the delight here as well as the wonder, a sense of confidence in being indefeasibly held in an utterly gracious reality. No wonder the early church proclaimed so boldly that a new age, filled with new possibilities for human being, had dawned. This was the faith, the picture of how things most deeply are that they had come to hold and that they had to share. And it changed everything. The character of their communal and moral life, their religious practice, the way they related to the world around them, and so on. How does someone come to know this picture of the world for themselves? How do they receive this faith in how things are, which the Catechism rather dryly characterises as the virtue by which we believe in God and believe all that he has said and revealed to us, and that Holy Church proposes for our belief? If we are not first-hand witnesses, as the disciples were, what makes it possible truly to believe the story our tradition tells about the nature of ultimate reality as loving, gracious, merciful? How are we enabled to entrust ourselves to it as they did? After all, in the face of how things go in the world, it's a hard picture to sustain. In fact, given the magnitude of suffering and the many triumphs of evil, faith in the enduring goodness and presence of God seems at times literally incredible. Well, what I've suggested is that it's the practice of deep listening and self-dispossession, the practice of obedience, whether in meditation or moral life, that opens us to this knowledge, though it is beyond knowledge. John Main taught that as we consent, however fitfully and imperfectly, to yield ourselves to God, we mysteriously find ourselves held home. In contemplative practice, we increasingly experience God as Jesus did, not as an object of our perception, but as the ground, the source of our being. As this awareness grows, then even in times of distress and confusion, when we may struggle with a sense of meaninglessness and are tempted to give up on it all as just some consoling fantasy or fairy tale, even at those moments, we may discover that almost despite ourselves, we are faithful, that is, full of faith. It's as if we cannot but keep trusting this fragile sense of the truth of things. Somehow it will not let us go. We find ourselves resonating with Peter's response to Jesus, "Lord, to whom else shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." And if we find ourselves in that place, living from that experience, the virtue of faith has been infused. The virtue of hope is then closely related. If this is how we experience the world, if it's the way we find ourselves responding to the world, then not only is God the ground on which we stand, but God is the future towards which we move. And hope is the gift of energy to live from and in accord with this future. In the New Testament, hope is particularly connected to the Holy Spirit. And Rowan Williams has said, "The Spirit is that which impels us forward, which creates hope out of our cries of protest in the present." We protest because we've tasted this new possibility for life, this abundance, this gracious reality, and yet our present experience doesn't reflect that, or doesn't fully embody that. We know now, he says, that our present pain is not the whole of reality, that behind it is a more final fact, God's vulnerable love drawing us forward. In Christian understanding, hope is not a natural phenomenon. It's not optimism or the tendency to anticipate that things will just get better or will naturally improve. In the wake of Jesus' death, the disciples had lost all sense of that kind of hope. So James Allison says, the gift or the virtue of hope arrives as a rupture in the system. It breaks into lives which are driven by death or despair. And it draws us to participate in the realization of God's abundant life. In my experience, hope has sometimes unexpectedly erupted when I am deeply present to the suffering and pain of what I cannot change. There dawns some inexplicable confidence that all will be well, and a sense also of there being traction between what is now and what is not yet. There's a quality of expectancy, as if something has already happened, something can already be trusted, but there remains a necessary work of remaining true to that reality. So while hope entails a sense of waiting on its fulfillment, of looking towards its fulfillment, it's not just passive, filling in the time until God comes. Hope implicates us. Our alertness and attentiveness, our acting in accord with its promise matters. Alison writes movingly of the difference between hope as hope of rescue and hope as the patient forging of a counter-story in the midst of the world's violence. The New Testament letters call for patience, endurance, perseverance in connection with hope. 1 Peter, for example, exhorts his readers in the face of their persecutors, "Do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated. But in your hearts, sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence." It is hope, Alison says, that empowers us to bear the crushing violence of the world, precisely because it keeps the mind fixed on the God who is revealed by Christ, by the victim seated at the right hand of God. Or, as the Catechism puts it, the virtue of hope takes up the hopes that inspires our activities and purifies them so as to order them to the kingdom of heaven. It keeps us from discouragement. It sustains us during times of abandonment. It opens up our hearts in expectation of eternal beatitude. Buoyed up by hope, we are preserved from selfishness and led to the happiness that flows from charity. And this brings us finally to love. The virtue of love, like all the theological virtues, is sourced in the being of God. And God is the God who makes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. The love of God is not based on preference or partiality. It is not earned or merited. God simply is love. And when we love with the love of God, then we are, as the gospel puts it, children of God, capable of loving our enemies and praying for those who persecute us. The poet Czesław Miłosz, Polish poet, captures the felt experience of this love in relation to love of self. He writes in a poem called Love, "Love means to learn to look at yourself the way one looks at distant things. For you are only one thing among many, and whoever sees that way heals his heart without knowing it from various ills. A bird and a tree say to him, 'Friend.'" Love is the energy that heals, befriends, makes whole. And it seems to me that this sense of looking at ourselves the way one looks at distant things is true also of what it means to love others with the love of God. Miłosz writes of someone who has learned to love, then he wants to use himself and things so that they stand in the glow of ripeness. He wants to use himself and things so that they stand in the glow of ripeness. I think this is about seeing ourselves, seeing others, seeing the world whole. The glow of ripeness is a fruit of letting be. It allows us to be present to things and people as they are, in the light of God, beloved of God. The sense of distance here is not that of uncaring indifference or uninvolvement, but of non-possessiveness. The theological understanding is that it is impossible to love the human other, just as it is impossible for me to love myself without God being involved as the animating presence. And this is because, as Rowan Williams puts it, it's the presence of God that secures in our love a sense that the other is at some level free of my needs and preoccupations. They are turned toward God before they are turned towards me, and turning back constantly into that light. In other words, I think what he's saying is that it's the non-possessive love of God that animates and makes true my love, because it liberates it from this entanglement of my need, my projection, my agenda. And this is why the Catechism speaks of love as the virtue by which we love God for God's own sake, not for what God might do for me, not for what God has promised, but simply because God is God. And so it is with our love for others. So faith, hope, and love. These are virtues or habits of being that are directly tied to the nature of God, to Trinitarian life. It's because of who God is that they arise in us as we are open to the divine life. And as we receive them, we become more like that. We are conformed to the divine life. And these are habits of being, this practice of this virtue of faith, this virtue of hope, this virtue of love. They are habits of being that keep us oriented to and living from the life and goodness of God. And so what strikes me in the felt experience of these virtues is an element of non-attachment. There's little ground for pride or moral satisfaction here. There's just gratitude at finding these dispositions growing in us and realizing the difference they make for our way of being in the world. Though, of course, just because they are not our possession, our achievements, we're never secure in our exercise of these virtues. Hope can erupt unexpectedly and graciously, but I still have moments of despair. Faith holds me fast, but I still have times of anxiety and doubt. And love, well, speaking for myself, that steady, merciful regard for myself and the other, as we are in the light of God, of God's gaze, that seems to be the most difficult of all to sustain. So we are infused with these virtues and we grow in them only to the extent that we're willing to keep letting ourselves go, being handed over in prayer and in obedience to the life of God. And this is a journey, quite obviously, without end. Yet at the same time, we do experience ourselves being changed. Our growth in faith, hope, and love affect how we see, how we are, how we act. As the Catechism puts it, the theological virtues are the foundation of Christian moral activity. They animate it and give it its special character. And they inform and give life to all the moral virtues. And it's to a little more exploration of these other virtues that we're going to turn next week. So that's it. Another block of undigestible.
That's it.
That's it.
Well,
That's all I have to say right now.
good. All right. That's enough for now. Thank you. I was thinking, in fact, I wrote down, you dare to raise very basic questions and pressing questions, and you make them very fresh and urgent, and then you answer them, but you answer them without making them seem more narrow and as if, you know, you've got a solution to these questions. But you do answer them or respond to them, but you answer them by making the questions, or making us see just how large the questions are. And that really is instructive and enlarging and hope giving and energizing. So I think you've done it again. Thank you so much on behalf of us all. Great and simple, as somebody said here, Gabrielle from Mexico. And anyway, beautiful words to ponder on. Somebody else. These talks really speak to me, opening and deepening important aspects of my life now and earlier. So appreciate your insights. So, and I'm not leaving out the negative ones, because there aren't any negative ones. They're all very affirmative, and I think you also have clearly the gift of encouraging people really to listen, to really obey, to listen to what you're exploring and opening up in these questions. So thank you. I don't know if there are any specific questions, Leo, that people have been putting. While he looks for them, what's that one? Okay, from Alan Faulkner. Yeah. Are you saying, Sarah, are you saying hope does not change reality, but allows for us to live through the reality given, having the faith that somehow, because of God, things will eventually be something different? Do you see that?
Yeah, I do. I'm having a little ponder. It's a great question. I'm inclined to say I think it does change reality. I mean, I guess, you know, and this is very mysterious, and it's hard to know exactly which concepts do the work, I guess. But I guess I've certainly, in my own experience, felt as though, because this quality of hope is, it has a felt sense, and you can stumble into it and then stumble out of it again, you know. But there have been times, and I don't know if others feel like this, but you feel like you kind of somehow in the really in the stream of hope, which is maybe the same thing as saying you're kind of tuned into the spirit and what the spirit is doing, but there's a sense in which being joined to that, you know, is somehow matters. Now, you know, at another level, I can think, well, you know, the puniness of my being joined to anything, how does that do anything? But anyway, we talk about this idea of participation, and there can be a felt sense of some kind of traction happening is the best metaphor I've got for it. So, and I do think there's something, and it's a bit like hope. It's a bit like you're invited to be stretched out between, you know, stretched out to that future or that promised future. And there's something about the being willing to be stretched out in that way that helps to realize that future or that promise. So I think, I'm not sure that I say hope just by itself. If I just sit around hoping, that doesn't change reality, but hope in that sense of being joined to something that's, you know, that God is doing, that can change reality, I think. And I think we can taste a little bit of that. Don't know if that answers your question, Alan, but
Sarah, there are two more questions in the Q&A tab.
Okay. Is obedience uniquely derived from or based on relationship? Yeah, I think that sounds right. I mean, as John Main and Father Lawrence often say, that obedience, you know, the root is ob audire, which is to do with listening. So I think there is a kind of there's a responsiveness. And you know, maybe it's not necessarily relationship. Well, I guess what I've been saying is there's always, whatever the circumstances, it's always possible to be responsive to and in relationship to God. But we're also in relationship to our circumstances. And part of what I've been trying to tease out is what it might mean to be obedient to our circumstances, at least in the, you know, in that kind of subtle, well, the way I was trying to tease out. So I think it has that relational quality to it. And then the other question says, it seems like a matter of being grounded in reality and yet at the same time open to the infinite love that is constantly poured out on us. I think that's right, and I guess the faith piece of it is that the faith piece says the nature of ultimate reality is also infinite love. So the love is both the ground and is what is kind of coming towards us, and somehow our participation in that is part of how we live out daily ordinary life and bring daily ordinary life into that kind of more fully into that loving, transfiguring dynamic. And I thought there was one other here.
I think so. There's one in my mind, but maybe you can see that.
Yes. Oh, well, I'm very acute, Lawrence. So.
No, I was thinking you really give a new lease of life to these traditional and familiar Christian ideas, theological virtues. And one of the reasons you do it, I think, and maybe you could say a word about this, is that you manage to describe these as experiences as related to wholeness and a process of divinization, of sharing, participating in the life of God, rather than of being perfect, virtuous, righteous, okay in God's eyes. So being perfect, being imperfect and being sinful. So what you were saying towards the end was that you discover that these virtues grow in us, and we're surprised by that. I think it's very much how people relate to meditation and why they stay with meditation, even though they know they're not perfect meditators. Nevertheless, they are aware of things growing in them, attitudes to life, ways of resilience, ways of recovery, being compassionate, when you don't feel like, even when you feel angry, those sort of things that surprise us. And it's that being surprised by the resurgence of the life of God, which I think is our being divinized. And it's just little glimpses of the early stages of a process which has this glorious outcome. But that seems to me very important, the way you're saying, you can have the virtue of faith and still have quite a lot of doubt. You can have the virtue of hope and still despair at times. And you can have the virtue of love and still be, a bit of an egotist. So am I right in saying that? Do you see that as this movement in traditional Christian thinking from perfection to wholeness, and that the process that you're describing is theosis?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, Lawrence. I think that's right. Because I think there's something in the older model, which, and I think probably wasn't, the best theologians never meant it that way, but it gets received back into, well, effectively a reward punishment kind of mentality. So I'm trying to get to be good so that then I'm accepted or okay, or I get to heaven, or whatever. Whereas this is in a way it's a kind of more organic process, except that it's not just a natural process, but it's a kind of growing into something. And I think part of what you're saying is, I really resonate with that sense of being surprised. And I think part of what that helps to give us confidence is that, as James Allison, someone said, who's James Allison? He's a English-born theologian who lives now in Spain. But he talks about, he often uses the phrase God as another other, a capital A, another other. And I think this sense in which we are surprised is part of that encounter of this is other, like, actually, oh my gosh, it's true. There is this other at work. And part of this is tapping into, being tuned into that, such that we are changed by it. And the process of divinization.
Thank you. Well, I also think these are really important insights to sustain us and prepare us for enduring this long crisis that we're passing through. And even though, in a sense, it's being lifted, some of the restrictions are being lifted in different parts of the world, at the moment it looks certainly as if the crisis itself is very uncertain and is going to continue and have some quite devastating consequences, especially for the most vulnerable, of course. So I think these are really not just abstract ideas about angels and the heads of pin on the head of a pin, but these are really resources that help
Yeah.
us to make sense.
Yes, and I think that idea of resource is important because the naming of them and the becoming aware and helps us to keep growing in them, or at least to realize where we've, where we kind of dropped out of alignment or whatever. And I think knowing this is it's a new possibility for human being that we're talking about, like being human differently. And I think that is what we're seeking to, to kind of know and to live from.
Well, again, on behalf of everyone, Sarah, thank you very much. And we'll let you go now to prepare your talk for next week. And the many other things that you'll be doing between now and then. But anyway, we all send you our love and gratitude, and thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here, and see you next week. And send more questions if you'd like. Send more questions, and the dialogue is great. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.